Now, I will tell you about the dangers of life in the Wild West that none of us could cope with, but they were part of everyday life for people of that period. You will learn all the secrets of survival that are not written in history textbooks. Before us lies the endless prairie. The only point of light for hundreds of miles around is the tiny window of a log cabin, a lonely bastion of civilization in the middle of the wilderness. For a family of settlers, nightfall was not just a change of time of day, but the beginning of a long, tense watch. Every rustle behind the wall, every hooting of an owl, every crack of a branch in the forest could be anything from a harmless animal to a deadly threat. Night transformed the familiar landscape into a hostile, mysterious territory. In these conditions, survival depended not on the strength of the walls, but on vigilance, rituals, and unique tricks developed in the daily struggle for life. This is not a story about battles, but about the quiet, almost silent confrontation between man and darkness. It is about how simple farmers became sentries and their homes became fortresses. Watch the video to the end to learn what subtle tricks and psychological techniques allowed families to survive the long nights of the Wild West. I will reveal the best-kept secret of survival on the frontier, and it has nothing to do with weapons. The main enemy of the settler at night was not so much a real threat as his own imagination. Absolute darkness and silence, interrupted by unfamiliar sounds, created enormous psychological pressure that could be more exhausting than any physical labor. Therefore, the first line of defense was mental calm and strict discipline of the mind. Families developed special rituals that helped them structure the chaos of the night and maintain control. These repetitive actions became a kind of defense mechanism against fear. At dusk, slow but methodical preparations began. All tools left outside were brought inside, and livestock was herded into shelters. Each family member knew their task, and these routine actions helped to dispel anxious thoughts and focus on specific tasks. Particular attention was paid to sounds coming from outside. The settlers learned to distinguish the natural noises of the prairie, the howling of coyotes, the rustling of the wind, the cries of night birds, from those that indicated the presence of humans. An unnatural silence, when the familiar chorus of nature suddenly fell silent, was the most alarming sign. Inside the hut, an atmosphere of restrained calm was maintained. Conversations were conducted in hushed tones so as not to drown out the sounds from outside. Panic or loud exclamations were strictly forbidden, as they could not only betray fear, but also prevent the hearing of approaching danger. Over time, the settler's ear became incredibly sensitive. He could tell from a barely audible crunch whether someone had stepped on a dry branch or wet leaves. This skill, honed by hundreds of sleepless nights, was more valuable than any weapon. Many kept a heavy object, such as a poker or an axe, near their bed. It was not so much a weapon as a psychological support. The ability to clutch something heavy in their hand at any moment gave them confidence and helped them cope with their growing anxiety. The key element was accepting the fact of constant danger. The settlers did not try to deceive themselves with thoughts of complete safety. They accepted the night as a work shift that simply had to be endured until dawn, maintaining maximum concentration. This psychological armor, forged from routine, discipline, and a deep understanding of their surroundings, was the foundation of their survival. Without it, even the strongest walls and the best weapons would have been useless. It was the ability to control their own fear that turned an ordinary family into the garrison of a small fortress. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about how modern people, accustomed to the noise of the city, would cope with such absolute, intense silence? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Want to know the secret that turned an ordinary wooden log cabin into a real bastion on the edge of civilization? The protection of the house began long before the family moved in. It was thought out even when choosing a place for construction. Every step, from clearing the site to the last beam in the roof, was guided by one idea: survival. Experienced settlers never built a house in a low-lying area or near a dense forest. It was too easy to approach unnoticed. The ideal location was considered to be on a small hill or slope, from where there was a good view in all directions. The natural terrain itself became part of the defensive strategy. The first step was to clear the area around the house. Trees, bushes, and even tall grass were cut down within rifle range, about 50-70 meters. This open space was called a safety clearing. Neither humans nor animals could hide there without leaving traces. Such an open space also served as a psychological barrier. Anyone who dared to approach the house immediately came into the defenders' field of vision. At the same time, the settlers often planted the edges of the clearing with low thorny bushes, which slowed down movement and made it difficult to approach stealthily. The walls of the log cabin, made of thick logs, were already a natural armor. Logs with a diameter of 25-30 centimeters could stop a bullet from a flintlock musket. The corner joints were made in a bowl shape. The logs fit into each other, forming a tight lock without gaps. In these places, the wall was particularly strong and served as a support for the entire structure. The gaps between the logs were carefully caulked with moss, clay, or tow. This protected against wind and cold, but also prevented arson. Fire could not spread quickly through the sealed joints. Thus, even simple thermal insulation became an element of protection. Windows were considered vulnerable points. Therefore, they were made small and few in number, sometimes only 2 for the entire house. They were placed above human height so that it would be difficult to look inside or shoot through them. At night, the windows were closed with heavy shutters made of oak boards, secured with iron hinges. The shutters were locked from the inside with massive wooden bolts. Some families additionally reinforced them with metal strips. If necessary, the shutters could also serve as loopholes. A narrow slit was made in one of the boards through which it was possible to observe the courtyard. The main entrance was the most important part of the house. The door not only protected the house, it determined whether the family could withstand the first attack. It was made of several layers of boards laid crosswise and fastened with forged nails. Instead of a regular lock, a wooden bolt was used. It was inserted into grooves carved into the walls. The weight of such a bolt could reach 20 kilograms, and it was almost impossible to break down the door from the outside. A musket or an axe was often kept near the door on the inside in case of a sudden visit. But protection was not limited to doors and windows. Tiny holes barely noticeable from the outside were left in the walls. Through them, it was possible to fire without exposing oneself to danger. They were placed at an angle to shoot along the walls and eliminate blind spots. Some experienced settlers even made loopholes in the attic so that they could defend themselves from above if necessary. From this position, it was possible to see the approaches to the house and notice movement in advance. Even the chimney was thought out to the smallest detail. It was built of stone or clay and made so narrow that a person could not climb inside. Sometimes a stone slab was installed on top, which could be moved with a stick, knocking down anything that tried to get in from above. The floor in the hut was often earthen or clay. Such a covering not only saved time, but also made footsteps silent. In case of danger, the defenders could move inside the house without giving themselves away with the creaking of boards or the rattling of floorboards. The foundation of large stone served not only as a support, it prevented the lower crowns from rotting, but most importantly, it prevented the enemy from digging under the wall. The house stood firmly, as if it were part of the landscape, and withstood not only an assault but also a storm. In some places, the settlers added additional fortifications. Around the hut, they could put up a palisade, stakes as tall as a man, driven into the ground at an angle outward. This made it impossible to make a sudden throw or attack from close range. Sometimes a small moat was dug next to the house, which filled with water in the spring. It prevented the walls from being set on fire or anyone from sneaking up at night. Simple geometry, stakes, a moat, and open field, turned the hut into a fortified point capable of withstanding an attack by a small group. But even the strongest hut was powerless if its inhabitants did not know what was happening outside. Therefore, the defense system also included surveillance. Dogs, bells on the fence, strings with hanging cans. All of this served as an alarm system that reacted to the slightest movement. Night seemed to be a time of danger, but the settlers learned to deprive it of its main weapon: surprise. They turned their homes into living fortresses, where every board, every crack, and even the silence of the floor worked for survival. Want to know how exactly the settlers organized these early warning systems and what happened in the hut when the first alarming sound was heard outside? Read about it in the next chapter. What I'm about to show you is illegal in 12 countries. Just kidding. But this secret is really known to very few people. Settlers created real early warning systems using the simplest and most accessible materials. Their main task was to make the night talk, turning silence from an enemy into an ally. One of the most common tricks was the signal thread. A thin but strong string or wire was stretched at a low height above the ground around the perimeter of the hut. Anyone who tried to approach the house in the dark would inevitably touch it. Attached to this string were rattles, empty tin cans, old pots, or bundles of metal objects. The sharp, loud clanging that rang out in the silence of the night was the best alarm signal. It not only woke the inhabitants of the house, but also often scared away uninvited guests, depriving them of the element of surprise. A more complex system was the so-called creaky floorboards. In front of the entrance to the house, or under the windows, the settler deliberately left several loose boards lying on stones. It was practically impossible to step on such a structure without making a sound. Some settlers went even further and created entire sound maps around their homes. They deliberately scattered dry brush in some places and removed it in others. Knowing the location of these noisy areas, they could determine from the sound which direction the danger was approaching from. The paths leading to the house were also equipped with traps. For example, a thin sheet of tin covered with earth could be placed on the path. The characteristic hollow sound made by the metal underfoot was clearly audible in the hut. The settlers learned to use the natural features of the landscape. A stream flowing near the house was not only a source of water, but also an excellent sound amplifier. Footsteps on water or stones could be heard from a great distance. The house itself also became part of this system. A bucket left by the door or an unfastened board on the porch were not signs of sloppiness, but elements of a well-thought-out defense. The owner of the house knew about them, but an outsider did not. This approach transformed defense from passive to active. Settlers did not simply wait for threats behind thick walls. They placed their motion sensors throughout the area, forcing any intruder to reveal themselves long before they could pose a real danger. In this way, the night ceased to be completely blind and silent. It was filled with signs and signals that only needed to be read correctly. These simple but ingenious tricks gave the settlers the most valuable thing in any defense: time. What if I show you a time machine and we take a look at the pioneers' arsenal? Imagine a hut on the edge of the forest, nighttime, silence, and only the crackling of wood in the hearth. When the alarm sounded, this coziness was replaced by lightning-fast organization. Everyone knew their place and their duty. At such moments, the settlers' arsenal became the heart of the defense, small but incredibly well thought out. When the alarm sounded, the last and most compelling argument came into play: weapons. They were not hidden in locked rooms. They were in plain sight and always at hand. The house did not store a scattering of guns, but a carefully selected set that could provide defense against any unexpected event. At the heart of this defense was the famous Kentucky long-barreled rifle. For the settler, it was not just a means of protection, but an object of pride. Accurate, long-range, and deadly effective. It was kept where it could be grabbed in seconds, above the fireplace by the head of the family's bed, or on a special hook by the loophole. This rifle was ideal for long-range shooting. You noticed movement in the field, aimed and fired, preventing the enemy from getting close. But despite its power and accuracy, it required time to reload and attention to detail. One small mistake, and the weapon could fail. Therefore, in addition to it, there were almost always several smoothbore muskets or short pistols. These barrels were easier to handle and quicker to load. They were kept at close range to block approaches if necessary. This set allowed for different types of fire, both accurate and fast. Smoothbore guns were especially important at night, when quick action was required at close range. They did not have the range of a Kentucky rifle, but they made up for it in speed. A quick volley from several barrels could repel an assault attempt at the door itself. At night, all the weapons in the house were put on full alert. They were laid out at predetermined points, near loopholes, windows, and the entrance. This was not just a routine. It was a system where every place and every object was designed for an instant response. This arrangement was created in advance and rehearsed. Who takes the rifle? Who hands out the cartridges? Who checks the bolts? Thanks to this, at the first rustle, the whole house went into combat mode silently and smoothly, like a well-oiled machine. The key factor was the preparation of ammunition. Bullets were cast in advance and stored in bags or wooden boxes. Gunpowder was placed in dry horn powder flasks, which protected the charge from moisture. Paper cartridges were rolled up and kept handy, all so as not to waste a second. Several dozen ready-made cartridges were always kept close to the main positions. This allowed for prolonged firing without panic. In the conditions of a winter night or in the rain, it was precisely the dry, orderly supply of gunpowder and lead that determined the outcome of the skirmish. The whole family participated in the defense, and the roles were clearly distributed. It was not spontaneous adrenaline, but serious and calm discipline. Everyone had their own task. Everyone had their own line of defense. This order was achieved through years of habit and training. The head of the family, usually the most experienced marksman, took up the main position at the main embrasure or at the entrance. The rest, children, teenagers, and the elderly, performed auxiliary functions. They handed out weapons, brought ammunition, and watched the approaches. This distribution helped to maintain the defense without confusion. It was a real conveyor belt, working in absolute silence and with precise movements. While one was shooting, the second was already pouring gunpowder into the spoon and loading the next barrel. The third was preparing a new bullet. Everything happened as if it were a routine, honed to perfection in order to keep up with the pace of battle. Such a coordinated rhythm gave them an advantage. The attackers saw continuous fire and thought that there were many more people behind the walls than there actually were. Sometimes a single family acting calmly could repel several scattered raids. In addition to firearms, cold weapons were always kept at the ready. Axes, pitchforks, scythes, and sledgehammers, which served the household during the day, turned into formidable melee weapons at night. They were placed at the door and near places where enemies could break through. Such items were especially valuable when the enemy managed to break through the first line of defense. A heavy axe in the hands of a man standing at the threshold was often more convincing than a dozen bullets from a distance. Fighting in a confined space turned into a fierce battle where brute force could decide the outcome. Some families kept unexpected means of defense. For example, a pot of boiling water hung over the fire in the fireplace at all times. In the event of an assault, it could be thrown on the attackers at the threshold. Cruel but effective. Such measures were discussed at night, warning that the house was protected by all means. Boiling water, hot coals, even mats soaked in oil and set on fire. All this was part of the last resort kit. In frontier conditions, anything that saved lives was permissible. Moral dilemmas took a back seat when it came to the safety of the family. The defense system was multi-layered and deeply echeloned. From distant posts controlled by rifles, through the middle line of muskets, to the last front at the hearth, everything worked as a single mechanism. This allowed for a flexible response in the gradual repulsion of the threat. This multi-level thinking gave them a chance to withstand even a more numerous enemy. With competent coordination, each level gave time to regroup and inflict damage. For the pioneer, this was not a textbook tactic, but a real tool for survival. Every member of the family knew their maneuver by heart. Where to stand, what to take, where to step when retreating. This was not just a defense plan. It was a collective memory recorded in movements and glances. When the alarm sounded at night, people acted without thinking. Their muscles knew. But even the best weapons are useless without well-thought-out tactics and a calm mind. Bravery is important, but even more important is prudence. When to shoot, when to retreat, when to hide women and children. Tactical intelligence was often valued more than marksmanship. What would you choose to defend your home? One powerful rifle or several less accurate but faster pistols? The answer depends on the terrain, the number of defenders, and the style of attack. Just as in the life of a pioneer, every choice had a price and consequences. With the onset of darkness, life in the hut did not stop, but shifted into a special, semi-sleepy mode of vigilance. Sleeping as a family at the same time was an unaffordable luxury. Therefore, a strict system of night watches was established. The head of the family was usually the first to take the watch. His task was not only to observe, but also to conduct a final check of all defense systems. He personally walked around the hut, checking the strength of the bolt on the door and the reliability of the shutters. The guard was located in the darkest corner of the hut, from where he could observe the most dangerous direction through a special viewing slit. He sat in complete silence, motionless, turning into an ear. His task was to catch the slightest deviation from the usual nighttime background. The guard changed every 2 to 3 hours. The procedure was rehearsed down to the smallest detail and took place almost silently. The outgoing guard woke his replacement with a light touch so as not to disturb the sleep of the other family members. The handover was accompanied by a short, barely audible whisper. The guard on duty reported everything he had seen and heard during his watch. Wind from the north, no precipitation. Heard an owl hooting in the east, nothing else suspicious. The new guard took his post, and the one he replaced went to sleep. This continuous cycle ensured that the hut was never left unattended. Even for a few minutes, it was impossible to let down one's guard. Special attention was paid to the fire in the fireplace. It was kept smoldering all night long. It provided a little warmth and allowed the flames to be instantly fanned for lighting or boiling water in case of alarm. The rest of the family slept lightly and intermittently. They slept in their clothes with weapons at hand. Any unusual sound, any signal from the person on duty could instantly rouse everyone. It was a state of constant semi-readiness. Even in sleep, the subconscious continued to work, analyzing sounds and rustles. Many settlers said they woke up a second before the sentry raised the alarm. This system turned the family into a single, well-coordinated mechanism. Everyone understood their responsibility for the common safety. The night watch was not just a duty, but a sacred obligation, on the fulfillment of which depended the lives of everyone under the roof of this house. What if I told you that sometimes the best defense is not defense, but a cleverly created illusion? The settlers understood that the best battle was the one they managed to avoid. Therefore, they actively used various tricks to make their hut seem more protected and crowded than it actually was. One of the simplest but most effective tricks was to control the light. Candles or lanterns were lit and extinguished in turn for a short time in different windows. This created the impression that several people were awake inside, moving from room to room. Sometimes a settler would go outside and shout a few commands loudly and deliberately, indistinctly, as if addressing the guards. He would then return to the house through one door and quietly exit through another to repeat the maneuver on the other side. To an outside observer, it looked like a changing of the guard at a well-guarded facility. In some cases, mannequins were even used. Old clothes were stuffed with straw and placed by the window so that a human silhouette could be seen in the light from the fireplace. Periodically, the position of the mannequin was changed to imitate movement. If a family had several guns of different calibers, they could fire them in turn from different loopholes. The different sounds of the shots created the illusion that the defense was being held by several shooters with different weapons. This forced the attackers to overestimate the strength of the defenders. Sometimes the settlers resorted to outright bluffing. Noticing tracks nearby or hearing a suspicious noise, the head of the family might go out on the porch and shout loudly into the darkness something like, "John, can you see them on the hill? Get the boys ready to meet them." This psychological trick often worked. Even the layout of the buildings on the property was important. A barn or cattle pen could be deliberately built to create additional blind spots for observation from the forest, but still be clearly visible from the cabin. Anyone trying to hide behind them would have to cross open ground. The goal of all these tricks was the same: to make a potential attack too risky and unpredictable. Any attacker prefers to deal with a clear and understandable target. A hut that behaved strangely and actively aroused suspicion and made people stay away from it. The settlers played a subtle psychological game where their main weapon was not bullets, but information. They hid their true strength and projected an image of confidence and complete readiness. Often, this illusion was their most reliable defense. Do you think such methods of psychological deterrence are effective in the modern world? The fire in the hearth was the heart of the settler's hut. It provided warmth, the ability to cook food, and light. But at night, it turned from a friend into an enemy. The bright light from the windows and the smoke from the chimney were like a beacon in the dark, accurately indicating the location of the house and making it an ideal target. Therefore, at dusk, controlling fire and light became a priority. The hearth was not completely extinguished, as it was time-consuming and difficult to rekindle it. The flames were reduced to a minimum, leaving only smoldering coals that provided enough heat but almost no light. A special screen was often placed in front of the fireplace, or it was simply covered with a blanket. This was done so that the reflections of the flames would not be visible from the outside through the cracks in the shutters or doors. Any source of light inside had to be completely isolated from the outside world. The use of candles or oil lamps was kept to an absolute minimum. If it was necessary to light a fire, it was done away from windows and loopholes. Often, the family would gather in the center of the room, creating a barrier of furniture around themselves to further reduce the likelihood of light escaping outside. Complete darkness inside the hut also had a tactical advantage. The defender's eyes, accustomed to the dark, could better distinguish silhouettes and movement outside against the backdrop of the night sky. Bright light inside, on the contrary, would blind them, rendering them helpless. However, it was impossible to do without light entirely. The guard on duty needed a minimal source of light to check his weapon or reload it if necessary. For this purpose, tiny wicks burning in a dish of fat were used, which gave off no more light than a modern LED. This light camouflage was a mandatory rule of nightlife. The family plunged into controlled darkness, becoming invisible to the outside world. They sacrificed comfort for safety, understanding that invisibility was their main trump card. There was another reason to keep the fire smoldering. In case of an attack, the flames could be instantly fanned with bellows. A bright flash of light could blind an enemy peering into a loophole or breach for a few seconds. Controlling the fire was a real art. It was necessary to find a delicate balance between the need for warmth, the risk of being detected, and the tactical advantages of darkness. This nightly game of light and shadow was an integral part of the ritual of survival. Thus, the hearth served a dual function at night. It was a hidden source of life and warmth for its own people, and a potential weapon capable of blinding and disorienting strangers. Although many huts stood completely alone, settlers were rarely completely isolated. A few miles away beyond the forest or on a neighboring hill, there was almost always another farmer just like them. This invisible network of neighbors was an important element of collective security. A system of conventional signals existed between families living within sight of each other. It was simple but effective enough to convey the most important information. Fire or sound were most often used for this purpose. For example, if a family noticed something suspicious but there was no immediate threat, they could briefly place a lantern in a window facing their neighbor. This was a signal of increased alertness, urging others to be on the lookout. The neighbor, seeing the signal, responded in the same way, confirming that the message had been received. In case of real danger, the signals were more dramatic. One of the most common was a prearranged pattern of gunshots. For example, 3 quick shots in a row meant, "We are under attack, we need help." Hearing such a signal, neighbors did not rush headlong to the rescue. That would have been suicide. They lit a large signal fire on the nearest hill. This fire was visible for dozens of miles around and served as a general alarm signal for the entire settlement. This relay system allowed the entire area to be quickly notified of the impending danger. In half an hour, the news could spread over a huge territory. This gave other families time to prepare for defense or flee to a prearranged safe place. But now let's look at the construction process itself as the creation of a weapon. For a settler, a house was not just a shelter, it was the first line of defense and a tool for survival. Each stage of log cabin construction was planned with not only rain and wind in mind, but also possible conflict from outside. In this sense, construction became a strategic endeavor where mistakes could be costly. Choosing a location for the future home was the first and perhaps most important strategic decision. Before cutting down the first tree, an experienced settler would walk around the site, listen to the landscape, and look for natural advantages. He would assess the view, elevations, and shelters, imagining what the approaches to the house would look like at different times of the day. The terrain was studied as carefully as commanders study the battlefield. Settlers preferred to build huts on small hills. Even a low hill gave a noticeable advantage. You could see further from it, and it was easier to spot approaching people or animals. Such terrain made a surprise attack difficult and gave time to react. Plus, water flowed away from the house, protecting it from stagnation and dampness. This provided a good view of the surrounding area and prevented the enemy from approaching the house unnoticed. Visibility for many tens of meters allowed traces and shadows to be noticed before the enemy was within striking distance. The defender could prepare a response in advance, occupy the battlements, raise the shutters, close the sliding door. In this sense, the choice of a slope or hill was not a simple preference, but a well-thought-out tactical measure. The ideal location was one that had natural barriers on one or more sides. Rocks, ravines, and rivers reduced the number of directions from which an attack could come, thus reducing the need for a large number of defenders. The presence of such a natural barrier made the hut more secure with fewer resources. This saved the family's energy and time for other important matters. For example, a hut could be built onto a rocky outcrop that would protect the rear. Then on one side, the house was literally embedded in the rock and did not require additional protection. This technique was used by experienced settlers who knew how to choose a shelter so that nature itself would work for them. Outwardly, it looked simple, but in essence, it became a serious fortification. A river or deep ravine also served as an excellent barrier that was difficult to cross unnoticed and quickly. It was difficult to approach a body of water silently, and attacks there were most often detected by sound and waves. In addition, water provided an additional resource during a siege. It could be used to extinguish fires or cook food. Therefore, a well or stream near the house was desirable. At the same time, settlers avoided building houses in close proximity to dense forests or thickets. The forest was ambivalent. It provided firewood, food, and shelter, but it also hid enemies and made approaches invisible. The best solution was considered to be a distance that allowed control of the forest edge and visibility of people coming out of the shade of the trees. A simple line between the house and the forest often saved people from unpleasant surprises. The optimal distance was considered to be equal to the range of a bullet's reliable flight. This practical rule helped to minimize the risk of a sudden attack. Anyone standing closer would already be within the defender's line of fire. The settlers based their decisions on the capabilities of their weapons and formed a defensive zone accordingly. Thus, the accuracy of the guns dictated the layout of the farm. The design of the hut itself was also subject to the logic of defense. From the shape of the foundation to the location of the doors, everything was done with the intention of resisting external threats. These were not complex architectural solutions, but each technique had its practical explanation. The house had to function as a single defense system. Two-story log houses, or blockhouses, were often built. In this version, the upper floor protruded above the lower floor, creating a cornice from which defenders could observe and act. The structure was similar to an improved shield. If necessary, it was convenient to fire from it and control the perimeter. For small communities, it was a good compromise between living space and defense. The second floor protruded slightly above the first, allowing defenders to fire at those who tried to get close to the walls. This technique made it useless to try to jump up to the window or climb the wall without the risk of being spotted. The ledge made shooting easier and attacking more difficult and dangerous. This gave the defenders a psychological advantage. In such two-story buildings, the living quarters were often located on the second floor. This increased the safety of everyday life. The windows and balcony were located higher up, and access to them from the outside was difficult. At night, the family could retreat upstairs, close the shutters, and control the entrances while keeping goods and livestock on the first floor. This division of functions in the house was very practical. It was safer as the windows were high above the ground, and people could sleep peacefully without fear of sudden intrusion. In addition, the second floor retained heat better and was drier, important factors for health. Thus, the living quarters combined comfort and protection, making the house more suitable for long-term living. The first floor was used as a warehouse or shelter for livestock in case of danger. In peacetime, supplies, tools, and feed were stored there, and in times of alarm, animals were quickly placed there, which could serve as both a living shield and a source of sound warning of an approach. Having a place for livestock inside strengthened the defenses and facilitated logistics during a siege. The roof was made sloping so that attackers could not easily hold on to it, and so that snow would not accumulate on it. The steep slope made it difficult to climb from the outside and also accelerated the flow of water. This choice of roof shape was both practical and defensive. It reduced the possibilities for enemy action from above. The roofing material, whether shingles or turf, was laid in such a way that it was difficult to set on fire. Sometimes a layer of clay or earth was added as a fire prevention measure, and in northern areas, thick turf was used, which burns slowly and retains heat well. The method of laying and the choice of covering were an important part of the overall security strategy. Sometimes the roof was deliberately covered with a thick layer of clay or earth as a fire prevention measure. This made the house heavier, but more resistant to fire attacks. This measure was especially helpful in settlements where the risk of arson was high. In the frontier world, practicality often outweighed aesthetic considerations. Even the well and the source of water was placed as close to the house as possible. In a besieged house, water is life, and its loss could mean quick surrender. Ideally, the well was dug within a fenced yard or directly inside the foundation to ensure continuous access. This approach made the household self-sufficient for a short period of time. Ideally, it was dug directly inside the hut or in a small fenced courtyard so that in case of a blockade, it would not be necessary to go outside. The presence of an internal water source made it possible to withstand shelling and attempts to set fire to the house for longer. It was the simplest way to increase the chances of survival during prolonged danger. Every log and every stone in the construction of the house was placed with intent. The stones for the foundation were selected so that they could not be used to undermine the wall, and the logs were processed so that there was minimal space between the joints. This was not a game of precision for the sake of beauty. It was practical engineering at the level of a home craftsman. The most eagerly awaited moment of the day was dawn. The appearance of the first gray streak on the eastern horizon was not just the beginning of a new day, it was a signal of the end of a long, intense night watch, a symbol of victory over darkness and fear. With the first rays of the sun, the tension that had hung in the air all night began to slowly subside. However, it was still too early to relax. The final stage of the night ritual was approaching, the morning inspection. No one left the house immediately. First, they carefully examined the entire surrounding area through the loopholes and cracks in the shutters. The dawn light could reveal what had been hidden by darkness. Footprints, broken branches, any signs of a nighttime presence. Only after making sure that everything was calm outside did the head of the family slowly and carefully remove the massive bolt from the door. That creak was the sweetest sound, signifying the end of confinement. The family stepped out into the fresh morning air, and that first breath of freedom after the stuffy atmosphere of the hut was priceless. The first thing the head of the family did was to walk around the perimeter. He carefully examined the ground, looking for any traces that might reveal the presence of nighttime visitors. Every footprint, every flattened blade of grass was part of the story of the past night. The signal traps were also checked. If the tin cans were in place and the string was intact, it meant that the night had indeed passed quietly. If the trap had been broken, a thorough analysis of the traces began in order to understand who had approached the house and for what purpose. We can see that the nightlife of a family on the frontier was a complex, multi-level system based on psychology, engineering ingenuity, and iron discipline. It was a nightly game of chess with an invisible opponent, where the price of a mistake was life. The cabin was not just a house, but a living organism that could hear, see, and defend itself. The settlers of the Wild West proved that man's main weapons are his mind and will. The ability to turn everyday objects into elements of defense, the ability to read the signs of nature and control one's own fear proved to be more important than the thickness of walls and the amount of gunpowder. Their experience is a harsh but important lesson in how fortitude conquers the darkest times. The story of these nameless frontier sentinels teaches us that safety is not a given, but the result of constant, daily effort. They did not just build houses and cultivate the land. Every night they fought for their right to live and see another morning. What other aspects of life in the Wild West would you like to explore in our future issues? Perhaps you are interested in the lives of gold miners or the construction of the first railroads? Suggest your topics in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new journeys into history.